Hello everyone, welcome to session 2 of LTEC 782, Design-Based Research in Education. I'm happy to report that we're up and running. Our Canvas profiles are updated, our groups are formed, the intro articles have been read, and the intake survey has been completed. Thank you for diving in, and I've really enjoyed your video reflections, analyzing the Tuzen article in terms of the defining and universal features of design-based research. So I want to come back to situating design-based research, which we touched upon a little bit last week. And I want to emphasize today that design-based research has been described as a meta-methodology. And it's been called that because design-based research draws on other research approaches and methods in order to create solutions to practical and complex educational problems. At any one time, a design-based research study may draw on any of these approaches and methods shown here. And this is why it's considered a meta-methodology. And as we'll be seeing later in this video, because of its iterative nature, DBR recursively nests other research processes to search for empirical solutions to practical problems of human learning. So you might be wondering, why do we need another methodology? Well, the answer to that comes from dissatisfaction with the results of traditional educational research. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with the idea that researchers, practitioners, and policymakers have criticized many of the findings from educational research as having little impact on practice or even on the evolution of theory. Now, Brokamp and colleagues, in their analysis of the gap between education research and practice, identified 4 categories of criticism related to education research. First, educational research yields only few conclusive results. Second, educational research yields only few practical results. Third, practitioners believe that educational research is not conclusive or practical. And finally, practitioners make only little use of educational research. So these are some of the reasons as to why people have been searching for a new methodology or a meta-methodology to help address some of these gaps. Of course, we can think about these criticisms of educational research in relation to the Tuzen et al. Article. And I know you folks have done a deep dive on this in your video reflections, but we can ask ourselves, did this study's intervention solve a practical problem in order to generate an effective intervention and theory useful for guiding future work? In other words, did this study result in useful knowledge? And we could think about this question from different perspectives. As researchers, do we feel this study yielded conclusive or practical results? What about from the policy-making perspective? Or as practitioners, do we feel this study yielded conclusive or practical results? What I want to do now is show you an example of a design-based research process. My thinking here is that walking through the steps of DBR will make the whole enterprise a bit more concrete. Now, I want to emphasize that this is a model of DBR and that there are many other models out there. And in fact, we'll be looking at some of them later this week. Now, as we go through these steps, think about how the phases of this process might reinforce what McKenney and Reeves called the definitive and universal features of design-based research. That it is theoretically oriented, interventionist, collaborative, responsively grounded, and iterative. This particular example comes from Matt Easterday. He's a professor of education and social policy at Northwestern, and he's articulated a 7-step process as a promising way of generating useful products and effective theory for solving education problems. And you can see the 7 steps in his process outlined here. The first phase of the process has to do with focus. And in this phase, design researchers bound the scope of the project and identify the general problem. This requires specifying the stakeholders, their interests, their roles, and the resources of the project. Stakeholders can include those who can affect or are affected by the product, including learners, parents, employers, the community, and clients initiating the project. The next phase is the understand phase. In this phase, design researchers study learners, domains, contexts, stakeholder needs, and existing solutions. The understand phase investigates the problem through empirical methods and secondary sources, and eventually synthesizes that knowledge into a form that can be easily used later. The third phase is the define phase. In this phase, designers delineate the problem, including the learning goals and assessments, as well as constraints and the research question. The fourth phase is the conceive phase. And in this phase, design researchers imagine the solution. In other words, what designs might reach the goal of this initiative. These design ideas can describe prototypes of vastly different levels of complexity, ranging from communications to physical artifacts, software, services, programs, organizations, and even systems. In the conceive phase, the designer has not yet instantiated the product as a functional prototype, but rather creates a non-functional symbolic representation that allows the designer to analyze the product by determining its components and their relations. Now, I want to sidetrack for a minute to talk about the design argument. Now, design arguments identify the nature of the intervention and its intended effects. Now, here's an example. If you want to design intervention X for the purpose of Y in context Z, then you are best advised to give that intervention the characteristics A, B, and C, and to do that via procedures K, L, M because of arguments P, Q, and R. This is an example of how to structure a design argument that describes the characteristics of the intervention as well as the characteristics of the design process required to create that intervention. Okay, back to the DBR process. The fifth phase is the build phase, and this is when design researchers instantiate a solution as a usable prototype. In other words, the design is implemented in a form that can be used. And typically, this implementation is a minimal, viable level of fidelity. In other words, just enough to test the designer's idea. In the next phase, the test phase, designers evaluate the efficacy and behavior of the solution in context. And you can see outlined here that there's earlier stages of testing, middle stages of testing, and later stages of testing. And the methods that you use for either formative or summative evaluation in each of these stages is very likely to be different. And then ultimately, the last phase of the design-based research process is to present. And in this phase, design researchers communicate to key stakeholders why and whether the design solves a problem that addresses their interests. Presenting requires the designers to explain the problem of concern, a new product that addresses the problem, and evidence showing that the design works and how, and often the process and insights that led to that design in the first place. I know that's a lot to take in. Now, I'm going to complicate things even further by arguing that this entire process, these 7 phases, can be recursively nested. So as you can see here in the understand phase of the top process, the understand phase may draw on grounded theory, and then in turn, that grounded theory may draw on a literature review. And then later on in the process, the test phase actually conducts a formal experiment in order to test the results of a design solution. And so this is an example of recursively nesting the scientific process and why DBR is considered a meta methodology. Okay, so where are we going with all of this? Well, this week we are going to study a generic model for conducting design research in education. And then we're going to compare and contrast this generic model with several other models that are out there within the literature. Okay, everyone, we're out of time for today. Have a great week, and I'll see you in Canvas.